The great virtue of the Roman Republic was its ability to adapt to changing times over the course of the centuries in response to social and foreign disturbances. Repeated successful successions by the plebs led to increasing political rights for the lower classes, while continual success in foreign wars brought vast wealth and power to Rome. However, Rome's continuous wars and territorial expansion had dramatic implications for Roman society. The great success of the plebeians had been in attaining political rights without resorting to violence. The plebeians were so successful in this endeavor that eventually a new class of wealthy aristocratic plebeians emerged. These new aristocrats dominated many of the political offices that had been reserved for the plebeians in order to protect them from the patricians. However, these noble plebeians viewed themselves as above the common pleb from whom they had derived, and often sided with the patricians. Thus, the constitutional protections which the plebs had enjoyed deteriorated, and social angst increased. In time, the character of Roman wars had shifted. In the early days of the Republic, military campaigns consisted mostly of local conflicts with Italian neighbors. Roman soldiers would fight for the campaigning season and then return home to farm their lands and partake in civic life. By the later days of the Republic, however, Roman conflicts had taken on a much more international character. Soldiers would be away from their fields and from civic life for years. Wars of conquest brought fresh lands that were divvied up by Roman aristocrats. The wars also brought millions of slaves into Italy from the surrounding regions. These concurrent processes led to increasing consolidation of wealth in Roman society and the formation of enormous latifundia, which were large agricultural estates specializing in the production of cash crops. Continually absent from their land and unable to compete with the slave labor at the disposal of the patricians, many plebeians were forced to sell their lands. These plebeians then entered Rome, where citizens were guaranteed free grain imported from North Africa. This led to an ever-increasing population of desperate and embittered plebs within Rome itself. When the grain shipments were threatened by pirates, or the harvests failed, mobs formed and fomented dissent throughout the city. The Roman underclass, forsaken by their own elite members as well as by the patricians, found champions within the military. Along with the changes in the Roman economic and social order, the Roman military structure also changed over time. Roman generals went from being citizen soldiers who served in the army as a function of their political career into professional, full-time military leaders. Victories in foreign wars gave these generals fame and popularity, and also plunder and land with which they might reward the legionnaires who served under them. This had a profound effect, as Roman soldiers became loyal to their general personally rather than to the Senate or to the state. This phenomenon is best exemplified in the career and rise of the Roman general Marius. Marius implemented a series of reforms over the military which would be crucial in undermining the Republic and leading to the rise of the military elites. Prior to the Marian reforms, individual soldiers were required to own land and provide their own arms in order to enlist in the military. As this significantly limited the number of troops available given the processes described, Marius abolished these requirements. This led to huge numbers of landless plebeians joining the army for the hope of plunder and grants of land. Marius also standardized the training of these recruits and reorganized the legions, forming a standing army of professional soldiers loyal to himself. In addition to foreign conflicts, these changes in Roman society led to massive conflicts within Italy itself. In the twilight of the Republic, Italy was destabilized by 3 servile wars, or slave revolts, the last and most famous of which was the revolt of Spartacus. These revolts were crushed, but shook the Republic and devastated the Italian countryside. Additionally, the social war was fought between Rome and her Italian allies, who were discontented in having to share in the fighting of Rome's enemies, but who did not receive the benefits of Roman citizenship. Although Rome was victorious on the battlefield, much of Italy was devastated again, and Rome ultimately succumbed to most of the Italians' demands, granting citizenship to many. The true death knell of the Republic was wrought from the civil wars which raged between Rome's 2 most prominent generals, Marius and Sulla. During the time that the social war was raging in Italy, the king of Pontus, Mithridates, was causing havoc in the lands of the eastern Mediterranean. Marius and Sulla feuded with each other over which of them should command the force to be sent against Mithridates, with Sulla ultimately being selected. In response, Marius incited riots in the city through his partisans, ultimately leading to the eastern command being transferred to him. Sulla, however, fled from the city, and taking command of his loyal legions which had been assembled, rather than march against Mithridates in the east, he instead marched on Rome itself. This was an unprecedented act in Roman history, as Roman arms were turned against their own city and fellow citizens. Sulla succeeded in driving out Marius, but the following years would see Rome vacillate between domination of the faction of Sulla and that of Marius. Sulla, and then later Roman rulers, published proscriptions, which were lists of political opponents who were declared enemies of the state and then murdered. This would prove the beginning of the end of the Republic, as civil wars would continue and increase in intensity over the years, until but one such commander was left standing in the form of the Imperator, or Emperor, who would ensure his sovereignty not through the decrees of the Senate or the Constitution of the Republic, but through his command of the military. Thus, the time of the Republic would end, and the time of the Empire would begin.